It's me. Hi, I'm the problem, it's me. For any of you who aren't Swifties, this comes from Taylor Swift's 2022 album and her song, Anti-Hero. And while it can be funny, as we just saw, it really is a powerful lyric because let's be honest, how many of us would confidently admit that we are the problem? Okay? Well, statistically, not very many of us. Because in a large study of 5,000 professionals, 95% of people believed and claimed that they were self-aware in social settings. But after testing them in those social settings, only about 10% actually were. Which means, according to math, that most of us are blissfully unaware that we are the problem. And that might actually be the problem. My name is Emily Scott, and I am the discipleship director here at Woods Chapel Church. And today we are starting a brand new series, I'm the Problem, where we'll be diving into the lives of some of these Old Testament's imperfect characters. And no, this series isn't designed to beat us up. This is about learning from people in the Bible who didn't always get it right. In fact, a lot of the time, they got it really, really wrong. But here's the good news. Each week, we're going to ask two simple questions. What can we admire about this person? And what can we learn so we don't repeat their anti-hero actions? So today, we are going to be looking at the character of Gideon, found in the book of Judges. And I've always really liked the story of Gideon, but when I was a kid, I think it had less to do with his actual story and more to do with the fact that he had the same name as my favorite character in my favorite movie, 7 Brides for 7 Brothers. It's all about 7 backwoodsman brothers who are trying to find a wife, and things don't go as planned. And yes, when I was a kid, my favorite movie was a 1954 musical, all about getting married in June. And yes, I may or may not have chosen my wedding date based off of this movie, because nothing says lifelong commitment like basing your marriage on a movie where the plot revolves around kidnapping. But the book of Judges is really a tragic tale of Israel, God's chosen people. And it shows the cycle that they get into of falling away from God and then God sending a judge to help them. And a judge isn't like what we think about today, but more like a chosen person from God to help God's people. So, and to kind of put that into perspective, Gideon's story takes place roughly around the 12th century BCE, which was right around the beginning of the Iron Age. And here we are, we're going to jump into chapter 6 of Judges, where the Midianites have taken over Israel. It says, one day the angel of God came and sat down under the oak that belonged to Joash, the Isbarite, whose son Gideon was threshing wheat in the winepress out of sight of the Midianites. The angel of God appeared to him and said, God is with you, O mighty warrior. So already in these short couple of verses, we get a glimpse into Gideon's character. So Gideon was a thresher, which meant it was his job to separate out the pieces of wheat from what they would use as the kernels to make the grain in their food, and the other parts that they no longer needed. And now threshing was supposed to take place on a threshing floor out in the open. But here we find Gideon in the winepress hiding away. Because if the Midianites found him threshing, 1, they probably would have stolen the food, and 2, he would have been punished for not turning over that food in the first place. Yet, here in this moment, where Gideon is even scared to make bread, God calls him warrior. Not coward and not hiding one, not scared survivor, but warrior. God saw something in him in that moment that I'm sure was the last thing on Gideon's mind. similar to how a caterpillar has no concept of flight. It crawls, it hides, and it survives. But God designed it for more. Gideon was hiding and surviving, and God was calling him to take flight. So immediately Gideon is like, are you sure that you have the right person? Because if the Lord is with me, I'm not sure if I buy that, because if you haven't noticed, things are pretty rough for us right now. But God then tells Gideon that it is he who is going to help his people against the Midianites. And again, Gideon is not so sure. This is what it says. But how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest, and I am the least in my family. The Lord answered, I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive. Now, if I heard this, I would want some confirmation, or at least a little clarification, because I have seen people leave in my life, and I've seen people make promises that they can't keep, and maybe that's something you can relate to as well. So if I were to hear God say, I will not leave you, and you will win against the very people who are making you hide in fear, I would want to believe that. I mean, I really, really would want to believe that. But even as much as I wouldn't want it to be there, I can see how that doubt could start to creep in. And Gideon wants to believe. He wants to trust God. But if he's anything like me, and maybe anything like you, he wanted just a little extra proof. So he says, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have promised, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said. So God says, deal. And the next morning, Gideon goes out to find that the fleece he set out with was wet with morning dew, but all the ground around it was dry. Yet, even that wasn't enough. So this is what Gideon says next. Okay, don't be angry with me, but let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew. And that night God did so. Only the fleece was dry, and all the ground was covered in dew. So when we read this, it's easy to look at Gideon and think, come on, man. You've literally seen miracles. What more do you need? Why do you keep hesitating? But I think if we're really honest with ourselves, we do the same thing. You know, we might not go out in our backyard and lay a fleece out, but we find our own ways to delay. So I'm going to read off a list, and I want to see if any of this resonates with you, or maybe you can think of someone in your life who does some of these things. So you plan it all out. You research every possible outcome. You pray. You flip a coin. You check out every single book or podcast about the subject. You make a pro or con list. You want to run it past a good 12 of your best friends. And then after that, you might even post it on social media and take a poll there. And then finally, after all of that, you decide, maybe I should just sleep on it. And now, while none of that is bad individually, it can become an excuse not to move. So is there anything in your life right now that is stuck in pause mode? Maybe it's to reach out and schedule that very first counseling session. Or maybe it's to have that difficult conversation that you've been pushing off, hoping that it would just resolve on its own. Or maybe admitting that we need help with something like addiction or anxiety. Maybe we're just waiting for one more sign, one more guarantee, one more wet fleece. But the reality is that God is giving us signs, even if they're not as dramatic as soaking fleece on the dry ground. God is whispering to us through people in our lives, through open doors and closed doors, nudging us and speaking directly to us. We're not alone in the waiting. and we won't be alone when we decide to move. So finally, after all of this, Gideon moves with about 32,000 troops to take down the Midianites. But along the way, God starts to talk to Gideon again and says, you know what? I think you have too many troops. So God has Gideon test his army. First, he tells anyone that wants to leave or that is scared that they can just go on home. And then what is left, he divides up based on how they drink water from the stream. And after all the tests, only 300 soldiers wanted to be there, and they were the ones who laid down on the ground and lapped the water like a dog, while all of the other soldiers bent down and cupped the water and brought it to their face. So the 300 soldiers that laid down and drank the water like a dog, those are the ones that God looked at and said, this is it. This is your army. I can only imagine what Gideon is saying in this moment. God, I told you I was scared. I really didn't want to do this, and now you're making it even harder. It was said that the Midianites' army was so vast that their camels, not their soldiers, their camels were without numbers, like sand on the seashore. That's terrifying. And maybe I forgot to mention, but Gideon's army had no weapons. Yep, God sent them into battle with no weapons. But you know what God said? Take the next step. What else could go wrong? So Gideon and his 300 soldiers kept going. And what happens next in Gideon's story is truly crazy. Because without weapons, Gideon and his 300 men are able to take down the whole Midianite army with only trumpets and clay jars. Now, you'll have to read that story for yourself in chapter 7 of Judges. But the reason we aren't going to talk about that battle today is because I truly don't think that's the most significant battle that Gideon had to face. Gideon did not see himself as a warrior, but God did. Gideon did not see himself as a leader, but God did. Gideon did not see himself as worthy, but God did. The fear, the doubt, the anxiety, that fight was harder than going up against the Midianite army. And we are all on that same journey as Gideon in one way or another. And it reminds me of two family members that I have that have been taking the test to become CPA accountants. And I've gotten a glimpse into the challenging road it is to get there. So if you are a CPA accountant, bless you. Because numbers are not my spiritual gift, so I can't even begin to relate. But to get certified, you have to pass 4-hour tests, and there is only a 45% pass rate for these tests. It takes years of studying, late nights, and lots of questions like, am I really even ready for this? What happens if I fail? And what if all of this was for nothing? My sister-in-law has passed all 4 of her tests, and my brother-in-law has only 1 test away. But both of them would say the same thing. The hardest part wasn't sitting for that 4-hour test. It was believing that they were ready to even walk into the room. Even in fear, even in doubt, even in questioning God, Gideon keeps taking those steps that God is laying out for him. God didn't expect Gideon to plan out how he was going to defeat the Midianite army with only trumpets and clay jars. That was God's job. Gideon's job was to keep taking the next step to get where God was leading him. So even when we don't have it all figured out, even if we aren't sure the end result, we can admire and strive to be more like Gideon and not let fear prevent us from walking into the room that God is calling us to. Now, wouldn't that be nice if Gideon's story could just end right there? He's a hero, and he saves his people, and he is remembered only for his amazing faith and the ability to follow God. But alas, this is the Bible, not an action movie, so we can't roll credits on Gideon's story just yet. So Gideon and his soldiers come back as heroes, and the Israelites want him to be their leader. So in response, Gideon takes all the gold that they collected from the Midianites, and he creates an ephod. And basically what that is what it would remind us of today would be like a knight in shining armor costume. But he molds this out of the gold, and then he places it in the middle of the town and says, "Let this be a reminder of how great our God is." But slowly, over time, it stops being about God. Instead, Gideon uses it as a way to remind people how great he is. And when I read that, honestly, I was sad for Gideon. Because here's the twist. For all Gideon has achieved, he still didn't believe what God had said about him. When God first met him in the winepress, afraid, God called him warrior. Even after leading a crazy battle where he was able to take down his enemies with nothing but trumpets and clay jars, Gideon still didn't see himself the way that God saw him. Deep down, he still felt like that scared kid hiding in the winepress, like he was the problem, like he didn't belong in the current role he was in. And I think many of us can relate to that feeling. So at the age of 4, I started playing soccer. And if you've ever been to a 4-year-old soccer game, it's more like magnet ball, where the ball moves. There's just like a clump of kids that run around with the ball. But as I got older, I really started to enjoy the game, and I played all the way through high school. And I wasn't one of the, really, really good kids that played on the team. My little sister, who was only 2 years younger than me, we played on the team at the same time. And she would say helpful things like, "Well, if you don't beat him to the ball, at least your elbows will." Thanks, sis. My running form was not the best, maybe a little aggressive, but one thing that I was actually good at was juggling the soccer ball, using only your feet and your knees to keep it up in the air like this. And so before matches, when we were warming up, I would do this, and a couple of my teammates might join me, and then every once in a while, I might even see a player on the other team look over as I was doing this. And so why was I doing it? Because, it really didn't help me warm up or get prepared for the match, and I don't know if I would even say that I was particularly proud of this skill that I had. I think if I was honest with myself, I was doing it because deep down, I wasn't sure if I was good enough to be on the varsity team. I wasn't the fastest. I wasn't the most talented. So I think if I could just remind them that I can do this really cool trick, maybe they'll forget that I'm not the fastest, I'm not that talented, I'm really not that special. What started off as a cool party trick became a mask. And I think that's what's happening here for Gideon. He built something that looked like it was for God, but deep down he was covering up because he still didn't trust what God had said was true. So are we wearing any masks? Is there anything that we're trying to juggle or manage that is getting in the way of having full confidence in God? Because the reality is that we can be so busy trying to prove to ourselves and to others and even to God, but we don't have to juggle for approval because we already have God's approval. And the last thing that happens in Gideon's story is that unfortunately history repeats itself. Just like the judges before him and just like many judges that are to come after him, Gideon does not help God's people stay on course. Instead, they fell away from God and started to worship other things. And it wouldn't be for another whole generation that another judge would come and try and do it all over again. Gideon wanted to be seen and remembered as a leader, but he didn't lay any foundation for the Israelites to grow or to learn or to rely on God for themselves. Gideon had to be at the center. He was thinking about his legacy, but he completely forgot to think about the next generation. Andy Stanley is a popular pastor, and we've referenced him in some of our previous sermon series. And one of the things he says is that your greatest contribution to the kingdom of God may not be something you do, but someone you raise. So who are you raising? Maybe for you, it is your kids or your grandkids. Or maybe there's someone that you work with that you can see and you can help mold and build them into the next leader, the next boss, the next person to take the company forward. Or maybe you have a friend or a coworker that you see something in them that they're struggling to see for themselves, and you can help raise them up. Who are we raising? Who are we raising and lifting up not to build our own name, but to build God's name? And that's the kind of thing that we got to see in action a couple weeks ago at the Adoption Resource Foundation annual golf tournament. It was a fun day with great weather. There were hecklers on hole 16 to mess with the golfers. And many of you were even there taking part in playing or serving to make it all possible. And all of it was in the hopes to raise money to help families cover the cost of adoption and build forever families. And what I love is that this whole thing was started by one person, Dave Kaufman, who didn't want the spotlight. He just wanted to help families and keep God at the center. But here's the thing, he didn't go at it alone. Dave invited others in, and he found people with the same passion, people with ideas and energy, and he gave them space to lead, and he built a team. And because of that one legacy-building step, and the way he empowered others to take it with him, the Adoption Resource Foundation has now helped over 350 families with more than $635,000 in scholarships and grants, with one day having the hope of funding a full adoption for a family in need. And here's the connection to Gideon. Gideon had the chance to build a legacy, but he made it about himself. Dave made his legacy about others. And even though Dave isn't with us anymore on this side of heaven, the lives he touched, the families he impacted, they're still growing. So the question that we are left with today, are we building a legacy that falls apart when we aren't in the room, or one that keeps going because we stepped aside and let God be in the center? Because here's the truth. We all have less than heroic Gideon moments. Moments when we're hiding in fear, second-guessing ourselves, asking for just that one more sign, and forgetting that God has already called us worthy. Moments that we can learn from so our story doesn't have to end on an anti-hero note like Gideon, but instead our story gets to be about shining the light of God and Jesus. Gideon had to hope that he was enough. We get to trust that Jesus is enough. Gideon had to fight battles for approval, but we get to start in a place of already being loved. So maybe today you're feeling like you are the problem, but because of Jesus, we don't have to stay stuck. Because of Jesus, we don't need one more fleece or one more sign. We already have the cross. Because of Jesus, the legacy that you are building isn't dependent on your own strength or your own perfection. It's based on grace. So maybe this week, when that voice starts to creep in again, that one that says, "You're the problem," you can smile and nod and think, "It's me. Hi, I'm the problem. But God's not done with me yet."